Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the history of the Catholic Church in the United States. Last time we made it up to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So we pick up today where we left off there. In 1821, the third successful anti-colonial War of Independence took place in this hemisphere. The first was the United States, securing independence from Great Britain. The second was Haiti, securing independence from France. And the third, which we begin with today, Mexico gaining independence from Spain. The background of which, elements within the Spanish colony of New Spain, that's what they refer to, what today is Mexico, as well as what are now the western United States, California, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada. So elements within the Spanish colony of New Spain initiated a war of independence against Spain on the 16th of September, 1810, under the leadership of a Catholic priest, Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla. After the defeat of, I should explain that, when Napoleon overthrew the monarchy in Spain, the Bourbon dynasty monarchy in Spain, he installed his brother-in-law, Jerome, as King of Spain. So there were colonial elements in Mexico, or New Spain, that were loyal to the monarchy, that felt, now that the monarchy had fallen, that they were absolved of their obligation of loyalty. And they felt no loyalty to Napoleon or any puppet that he put in power. So that's part of the background, although as we'll see there were many layers of complication within the colonial society that made such a move inevitable. Regardless of Napoleon, it was only a matter of time. We know this because after Napoleon was defeated in 1815, the Spanish Bourbon dynasty was restored to power as part of that whole movement of restoration. And they rejected the assertion of independence made by Mexico 5 years earlier in 1810. And they maintained a policy of reasserting dominion over their colonies in the Americas. 6 years, so fighting, in other words, a war, this is their war of independence, Mexico's war of independence. 6 years later, on September 27th, 1821, after losing the war, Spain accepted that their desire was not going to come true. So they recognized the independence of Mexico, which at the time included territory from Texas, the current state of Texas, all the way over to California. That area had been sparsely populated by Spaniards in the colonial period. So the New Mexican government feared that the indigenous peoples, particularly the Comanche and the Apache, would move in and drive out what Spanish colonists are now Mexican citizens were there. So their solution, formulated by the new government of Mexico, would lead to there's a law of unintended consequences. There's a policy or an initiative that is intended to accomplish a certain list of objectives. And then no matter what it is, there are always going to be unforeseen consequences, unforeseen outcomes. Whether or not the intended outcomes are achieved, there are always going to be those that are unforeseen, because people are people. Free will exists, and not everybody's going to behave as expected. And even if they do behave as expected, sometimes those outcomes are different than what we might anticipate. It makes history interesting. So the solution, the unintended consequence of this policy I'm about to describe by Mexico, is going to lead to Mexico losing that territory anyway, and in the course of a war against the United States. So we've already seen the United States invade to the north, invade Canada twice. Well, invade it more than once, but in two separate wars, the War of Independence and the War of 1812. So this, what I'm about to describe, is going to lead to a war with the southern neighbor, Mexico. So the solution formulated by the government of Mexico was to offer incentives for more settlers to come and settle in that territory. So that Mexico offered land grants to settlers from the United States on condition Mexico would grant them land on three conditions. First, they had to become citizens of the new Mexican Republic, which, and obey its laws and pay taxes and this is all that. Second, they had to convert to Catholicism if they were not already Catholic, which was because initially independent Mexico was going to continue the policy of Spain, in which the Catholic Church had established status, just as the Anglican Church was established in the English milieu. And third, they had to undertake militia obligations, meaning the new settlers had to defend the territory for Mexico against the Comanche and the Apache, and even, if necessary, against the United States, even if they had originally come from the United States. These land grants were eagerly accepted by thousands of Anglo settlers from the United States as well as from Europe. The stipulations made by the Mexican government were largely ignored. So the settlement was based on a pervasive pattern of duplicity. For example, that Anglo settlers from the United States who were Protestant would come in and claim they're going to fulfill all the conditions, including swearing that they were Catholic, in order to obtain the land, while clandestinely Protestant ministers continued to hold services for them according to their denominational practices behind the back of the government. More ominous still, the new government in Mexico proved to be unable, for a number of reasons that we'll get to, proved to be unable to centralize control over the vast territory by comparison to the growing United States. Now the reason, the population of Mexico at the time of independence was divided in its loyalties. And that happened in the 13 colonies when they revolted against Great Britain. There were loyalists there also, but the divisions within Mexico were much deeper because the colony was much older, and the colonies were grafted onto a much more complicated pre-Columbian, pre-European civilization. So the divisions were the old Spanish colonial aristocracy, the hacendados, the hidalgos, the ones the plantation owners. They were in alliance with the Catholic hierarchy of the country for the purpose of maintaining their positions of privilege and control. Now, this followed the European pattern that we covered in the medieval course of essentially feudalism, as that's what the colonies were. Essentially, the Europeans imposed feudalism on these colonies, and in which, and as in the medieval course with the feudalism problem, wealthy families often sent their younger sons into the church. Now, the oldest son would inherit the land, then younger sons would either go in the army or the church, and if they had many, a large family, sons would do both. They'd have some sons in the military and some in the church. So the families would arrange all this just as they arrange marriages for the advantage of the family, regardless of what particular vocation their child might have. So the result here in the Latin American context, just as it was in feudal European context, was a significant population in the hierarchy and in the church of those who did not have a vocation to the church. They were just, sent in by their families. And again, as in Europe, some embraced the vocation and lived lives of great holiness, but others just, did not. They felt no obligation to really live it, or the obligations they felt a higher obligation to their family, to conduct whatever position they had, bishop or whatever, in such a way to benefit their family and the class to which their family belonged, more so than the interest of the church. And if they ever had to choose between the interest of the church and those other interests, often those who had that attitude would choose the secular interest over the church interest. Opposed to them were radicals, as that term gets used a lot. So, to properly define the term, it's the Latin root radex means root. So radical, in whatever context that it's used, if it's properly used, whether it's in church context or secular context, means someone who wants to pull up the root of whatever structure, whatever construct exists, and replace it. True radicals are not looking to reform; they're looking to replace. Now, so these radicals, opposed to the entrenched landed aristocracy, despised elitism, especially hereditary elitism. So they wished to seize the estates of the aristocracy, which in their mind also included the church. So seize the estates of the church in order to divide them up and redistribute the wealth. Divide up the big estates, the hacienda estates, into smaller plots of land, so that the landless peasants could become small farmers and actually own their land. Now, later radicals, once communism was invented, had a different view about private property. But both, whether they wanted the small freehold model to enfranchise and economically elevate the formerly landless peasants, or whether the later communist model, which repudiated the idea of private property, what they shared in common is they both wanted to seize the large estates and divide them up. So in not only in Mexican history, but these other Latin American countries, similar patterns would develop, and often you'll hear the phrase land reform thrown around. And whoever uses it, what they mean is the government nationalizing or stealing, from the perspective of the estate owners, stealing their estates and dividing them up. Now, and there they differ. The communists would the government would just take it all over. Whereas other non-ideological radicals, just more economic radicals, just wanted to give to raise the peasantry from out of the peasantry and make them like gentry, landed gentry in England, small freeholders. So the original impulse before communism to do this was rooted in a sense of betrayal felt by the common people, meaning the non-landed people in Mexico, because they had joined the War of Independence and fought in the War of Independence to free Mexico from the Spanish monarchy, which in their mind meant also freedom from feudalism and that rigid class structure. So they did not envision the same that their colonial subordination to the landed aristocracy under the monarchy would continue if they won the war and made Mexico a republic. Yet the landed interest wanted exactly that, wanted just to continue things the way they were with themselves in charge. So these deep divisions prevented the new Republic of Mexico. It distracted the new government and prevented them from solidifying a centralized governing construct over a vast territory. And so, in Mexican history, as well as other Latin American countries, former colonies, the history would be characterized by the pendulum effect, which affects all countries, not just theirs. But the pendulum would swing in a particular way. It would plague Mexico into the 20th century and cause appalling casualties among the population and result in much suffering for the church. In terms of the history of the United States and the relationship of the United States with Mexico, and specifically the subset of church history in that regard, this dynamic would result in the Mexican-American War and the absorption of the former Mexican territory west of the Mississippi River, and eventually have it carved up into the United States. And part of that territory, specifically California, the admission of that into the United States would precipitate yet another dispute over slavery and states' rights, like the Missouri Compromise, like the one that led to the Missouri Compromise. But this one would lead to, finally, the Civil War in the United States. Okay. So in the year that Mexican independence was accepted by Spain, 1821, Bishop DuBourg in New Orleans, whom we met last time, but based in St. Louis, Missouri, obtained funding from the family of Charles Smith, who, with him we can catch up to earlier, we can connect back to earlier in the story, because Charles Smith was a Catholic from Maryland. His family moved to southern Louisiana to get land, and they prospered. So Bishop DuBourg got a donation from the family of Charles Smith in order to for the religious of the Sacred Heart to establish a foundation in Coteau in Louisiana. Again, we saw all this last time, but now we see how DuBourg develops it. And the purpose of this was to to start educating young girls, Catholic girls. The Sisters of the Sacred Heart arrived and took possession of their new home in Grand Coteau on August 28th of that year, 1821. Overlapping with that, the Cajun population, the former Acadians, the descendants of the former Acadians, of what was then Vermilionville, started demanding a church for themselves in their own location. For that purpose, a layman named Jean Mouton donated land, just as Charles Smith did in Grand Coteau, but Mouton did in Vermilionville, donated land on March 21st, 1821. And on May 15th of the following year, 1822, Bishop DuBourg carved out of St. Charles Parish in Grand Coteau a new parish on which to put this land. I mean, on a church for that parish would be put on this land, and it was placed under the patronage of St. John the Evangelist. He assigned one of the French refugee priests we met last time as the founding pastor. His father, he's the one that kept changing his name. Michel was his French name, but when he was serving, when Spain had the colony, he signed his name in the registers as Father Miguel, and then even later Father Michael. But it's all the same person. So Father Miguel Bernardo Barrier. In 1825, the name of the town, Vermilionville, was changed to Lafayette in honor of the Frenchman, the Marquis de Lafayette, who fought for the American Revolution against the British. And later in 1918, that Lafayette would become the seat of a new diocese that was carved out of the Archdiocese of New Orleans. Bayou Lafourche, in DuBourg's period, was a prosperous plantation waterway. Catholic population of Acadian descendants, they also demanded a church, as the existing parish dated from the Spanish colonial period at Plottonville was insufficient for their needs. To force his hand, Catholics in what was then called Thibodeauville raised money, built a church under the patronage of St. Joseph. The sacramental register for that church opened on March 5th, 1821, with Bishop de Bourgh himself offering the first confirmations in that church in 1821 during his first visit down the bayou. He assigned as a resident pastor another refugee priest from Europe, Father Antoine Potini. And he first signs the register on June 22nd, 1822. Later, in 1977, another diocese was carved out of New Orleans, the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux. And they have a cathedral in each one. They have co-cathedrals, St. Francis de Sales in Houma, and this same parish, St. Joseph in Thibodeauville, now just Thibodaux, was the co-cathedral there in Thibodaux, and it's still functioning. Pope Pius VII died the following year on the 20th of July, 1823. The conclave elected as his successor Annibale della Genga as Pope 252. He took the papal title Leo XII, reigned from 1823 to 1829. Leo XII would approve another round of ecclesiastical division and as well as expansion of the hierarchy in the United States, specifically the Louisiana Territory. But before we get to that, there were developments going on at the same time in Mexico, which is another step toward the Mexican-American War. That war, one can say, became inevitable on August 18th, 1824, when the new Republic of Mexico passed a colonization law to attract settlers, to cultivate the region, specifically in the state, the Mexican state at that time, Coahuila y Tejas. And apologies if I mispronounce that, so I'll just spell it out. Coahuila, the Y, Tejas, Tejas. The capital of this state was Saltillo, Mexico. So those who went to St. Ben's, although I don't know if St. Ben still does it, but when I was there, one of our mission trips would be to Saltillo, Mexico, where Padre Quinn was. I mentioned this one specifically because this Coahuila y Tejas included land north of the Rio Grande River that is now the state of Texas, and that would be the casus belli, the cause for the Mexican-American War, 22 years after this law. So this is when it solidified, and it wrote into law, Mexico wrote into law, the strategy for attracting settlements I mentioned earlier, and put some more specific numbers to it. In exchange for the three conditions, accepting Mexican citizenship, the Catholic faith, and militia obligations, a settler was granted, it was an impresario grant. Impresarios, can be translated as an entrepreneur, so to speak, a grant of undeveloped land to a person who would develop it. It was, it was 640 acres of land. And it could be used for whatever the topography indicated, either agriculture or animal breeding or some other use. There was among the most famous of the American settlers to accept this grant was Stephen Fuller Austin, Austin, as in Austin, Texas. He was a native of Virginia, migrated first to Missouri. There he learned of the opportunity of the Impresario grants. So instead of just taking a grant himself, which of course he did, he perceived an opportunity to act as a broker between, to recruit more Anglo settlers who would accept these grants. So he acted as an agent of the Mexican government in facilitating this. And this has all been traced. And from what can be documented, there may have been more, but from what can be documented, he personally is responsible for facilitating the migration of 8,000 American citizens who accepted the Impresario grants and therefore at least technically became Mexican citizens. Over the next 12 years, another 25,000 American settlers would take advantage of this colonization law to move into the part of Mexico that is now Texas. Part of the way they fulfilled the militia obligations to defend the area against the Comanche and the Apache, Stephen Austin arranged a meeting in 1826 that led to the creation of a paramilitary unit of commandos, essentially, but cavalry, mounted cavalry. And these are the Texas Rangers. This is the origin of the Texas Rangers, 1826. And as far as I know, that still exists. 1 year, in 1825, 1 year after this Mexican colonization law was written into the law of Mexico, the United States got a new president, President number 6, John Quincy Adams. He was born in Braintree, Massachusetts, the eldest son of the future president, John Adams. He studied and graduated from Harvard University, served as the secretary on diplomatic missions to Russia and England. Elected to the Senate in 1803 as a Federalist, he was appointed ambassador to Russia from 1809 to 1814. And now we think of Russia as an adversary, but remember at this period, Russia was a monarchy, extremely conservative monarchy. So Quincy Adams was ambassador there for 5 years, from 1809 to 14. Then he was appointed ambassador to England from 1815 to 1817. In that capacity, he was one of those that negotiated the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812. Appointed Secretary of State to President Monroe during the era of good feeling, Quincy Adams further negotiated the Adams-Onis Treaty that we alluded to earlier, by which the United States acquired Florida from Spain just by buying it. It was purchased just as we bought the Louisiana Territory. Quincy Adams entered the presidential race of 1824 as one of 5 contenders. One of his adversaries was Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, whom we met a few sessions ago. Now this is a case in which the popular vote and the electoral vote differed. So those issues, we're mindful of those from recent history, but that did not just start, in this millennium. Jackson won the most votes, but not a majority of the electoral votes. So he won a plurality, but not a majority. Plurality means he won the most votes, but it was not over half, so it was not a majority. The Constitution had provision for this. According to the stipulations of the 12th Amendment, which was ratified on September 25th, 1804, in the absence of a majority in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives was to choose the president. And if there was, in this case, 5 contenders, it would be they would choose from the top 3 vote get. Whoever got the 3 who got the most votes would be the choice. Even if, so, the other ones would not be considered. Okay, let that sink in. So the elections go into the House. The Speaker of the House was Henry Clay. Henry Clay despised Andrew Jackson. So Henry Clay was not a neutral participant in this. He supported John Quincy Adams, securing his election on February 9th, 1825. Widely condemned at the time as an injustice, a corrupt bargain, as they called it then, as stealing the election from Jackson is how it was perceived, especially by Jackson's supporters, since Jackson had won the most votes, both popular votes as well as electoral votes. And then the House, from at least the perspective of some, that the House just stole the election from Jackson. So Quincy Adams was irreparably weakened by this as president. And added to that, the next move would essentially destroy his credibility and doom him to only one term, when he appointed the same Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, leaving few in doubt that an actual corrupt bargain, had been reached to take the election from Jackson. So prior to that appointment, some could just think the Henry Clay, virtually no one doubted that Henry Clay manipulated things to take the election from Jackson. But prior to this appointment, the history of antipathy between Jackson and Henry Clay was known. So some would say, well, Henry Clay did it just, because he hated Jackson. But with this appointment as Secretary of State, then Quincy Adams is tainted. So they think, okay, he had to be involved. That he offered. There's no letters or anything or witnesses to verify. But so this is just what happens, and the natural inference was made. So Quincy Adams served only one term as president, like his father, John Adams, and Quincy was defeated in the next election by the same Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson served 2 terms as president. After he lost the presidential election, Quincy Adams remained active as a public figure. He got elected in the next cycle to the House of Representatives for his home state of Massachusetts, where he was deemed, both at the time as well as in subsequent writing of American history, as a far more successful ex-president than he was as president. He died at his post, literally. He suffered a stroke in the House chamber. Now, before his death, he was an abolitionist himself. Before his death, he predicted that the Union of the United States would dissolve over the issue of slavery, as indeed it did. In terms of religious history, in 1825, the year that, the election was 1824, but he was sworn in the next, so the year that Adams was sworn in as president number 6, Unitarianism came to the country. And this is significant because they would become involved in many humanitarian and social causes, initially as private religious endeavors that eventually were appropriated as endeavors of the government, some of which we just take for granted, like public schools. So The Unitarian movement was one of the numerous versions of Protestantism. The founder was the Calvinist in Hungary, Europe, named Ferenc David. In 1565, during the period of the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants, he pioneered. He understood that that Christians slaughtering each other could not possibly be the will of God. So he pioneered Protestant ecumenism, a version of ecumenism, under a slogan: "We need not think alike in order to love alike." Theologically, he revived the ancient Christological heresy. I mean, he was condemned as a heresy by Nicaea I of Arianism, in the sense that he denied the divinity of Christ, and then moved to revive a Trinitarian heresy, that of modalism, which denied the existence of the Trinity. Now, they didn't deny the existence of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but just did not understand it the same way that Catholics do. The three persons with the one divine nature. He taught that God was one, hence Unitarianism. And that Jesus and the Holy Spirit were not divine, that they were created and brought into being by God, and that they had particular roles in God's plan. His tolerance, this toleration, was not common among the Calvinist version of Protestantism. Certainly not in his time in the 16th century. So the Calvinists rejected him. They didn't, they didn't like this. So that's how it becomes Unitarianism as a separate denomination. So time passed. It made its way to the United States and flourished under the leadership of William Ellery Channing. Channing was born on April 7th, 1780, in colonial Newport, Rhode Island. He was a grandson of William Ellery, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. In 1878, William Ellery Channing graduated from Harvard Divinity School, first in his class. On the 5th of May, 1819, he delivered his milestone address, what turned out to be a milestone address in his public professional life, titled Baltimore Sermon, preached at the ordination of Jared Sparks as the first minister of the newly organized First Independent Church of Baltimore. So, like, as I mentioned this earlier, that many of the Protestant ministers and some Catholics also, like John Carroll, they prepared their sermons written out in advance in essay format, and so that they were subsequently published as pamphlets. And this Baltimore sermon, was one of those. It was published under a different title, in a pamphlet under the title of Unitarian Christianity, and it became a national bestseller. The principles that Channing articulated, repudiating the Calvinist anthropology, the theology of the human being, repudiating the Calvinist view that humans are totally depraved, and the total depravity of man, rejecting the Trinitarian theology, promoting and promoting activism in continuity with the social gospel as a replacement for so that the energy of the Unitarians would be focused on the social gospel and making the world a better place. rather than in theological disputes against other versions of Protestantism or against Catholicism or any other thing. This proved to be, this more positive, aspirational, altruistic interpretation of Christianity, of the social gospel, proved to be so popular at the time that the movement grew to the point where it was organized in 1825. So that catches us back up to Quincy Adams' presidency. Organized in 1825 as the first Unitarian denomination in the United States, called the American Unitarian Association. In their New England churches, these Unitarians became social activists, promoting such initiatives as universal public education, prison reform, state-supported medical clinics, and abolition of slavery. And then, as it developed also, women's rights, the suffrage, the women's right to vote, and labor rights, trade unions, the rights of workers. Now, on the other side, so we have this very positive aspirational view of Christianity, which is not Catholic, but also not anti-Catholic. So this was not the only development of within religion, within the Protestant American Protestant milieu, and the other continuity development is one that would impact the church negatively. From around 1820 to around 1840, a movement that was so pervasive that it was been given a name, the Second Great Awakening, took place within American Protestantism. And of course it would have an effect on Catholicism. The First Great Awakening was in the colonial period, and that, so I didn't talk about that. But this one is in the, it's after the early national period, so this is in the period of Continental expansion. The Second Great Awakening was spearheaded by a Connecticut Presbyterian minister, the Reverend Lyman Beecher. That's Lyman Beecher. So the Second Great Awakening was a version of the Protestant movement centered around preaching what they called restorationism. Now that term, those of you who read a lot, that term has another meaning, which is confusing because it overlaps in time with this. It also referred to the post-Napoleonic restoration of monarchies in Europe. And earlier in English history, it refers to the restoration of the Stuart dynasty, of Charles II of that monarchy, after Cromwell died and after his son, who for a brief time, for 2 years, was Lord Protector, but then negotiated the restoration. So that term has multiple uses. In this Protestant theological context of the Second Great Awakening, restorationism was a proposition that the only pure Christianity was that to be found in the proto-Christian church described in the biblical book of the Acts of the Apostles. One famous result of the restorationist movement was the Pentecostal movement, or sub-movement, which was based on replicating the Pentecost experience described in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2. Another infamous, there are always consequences foreseen and unforeseen. So another consequence of the Second Great Awakening was an escalation in anti-Catholic bigotry, because those who subscribed to this Protestant interpretation of restorationism naturally regarded, that just called attention to popery, as they said, that everything that existed in Rome and the Holy See and all that, they saw that as something completely antithetical to their ideal in Acts of the Apostles. So, this, I alluded to this earlier, and we will cover it in more detail because it happened actually in the next decade. The first burning of a convent of nuns in the United States occurred because of this guy, Lyman Beecher, and his antipathy toward Catholicism. And we'll go into the full context in its proper chronological position. In terms of Catholic history during this period, beginning in the same year, 1825, 2 years after the new Pope Leo XII accepted election, he expanded the American hierarchy, bringing further ecclesiastical governance to the Louisiana Purchase, as follows. On August 29th, 1825, Alabama and the two Floridas were carved out of the Louisiana Diocese and designated as an Apostolic Vicariate. Okay, so two things there. The two Floridas. That refers to the Atlantic side of Florida, and the Gulf of Mexico side of Florida. The Atlantic side of Florida, in church terms, was based at St. Augustine, Florida, originally founded by the Spanish. On the Gulf of Mexico side was Pensacola, where St. Teresa Church was also founded by the Spanish. So that's the two Floridas. An Apostolic Vicariate, we've encountered this earlier. That's a step in organizing mission territory. So the first step is that it's put under the authority of some existing bishop somewhere else. Then a priest is appointed apostolic prefect, like John Carroll. So in terms of holy orders, he's just a priest, but he's given extra faculties. Specifically, he's able to confirm. Then the next level up, if that works, then the next level of organization is the Apostolic Vicar. So remember, seminarians, in canon law, whenever you see the term vicarius or vicar, that's someone who exercises authority in the name of another. So an apostolic vicar is one who exercises authority in the name of the apostolic see. So he's an ordained bishop, considered an auxiliary bishop of the Diocese of Rome. All right, so that 1825, Alabama and the two Floridas as a unit become an apostolic vicariate. 11 months later, on the 14th of July, 1826, the northern region of the Louisiana Territory was carved out to create a new diocese, the Diocese of St. Louis, Missouri. 4 days later, on July 18th, 1826, Mississippi was carved out to as a separate apostolic vicariate of Mississippi. Okay, so those three things happened, 1825-26. So a few more details. The Apostolic Vicariate, the first one of Alabama and the two Floridas. The founding Apostolic Vicar was the guy we've already met, Michael Portier. He was born in Montbrison, France in 1795, studied for the priesthood at the seminary of St. Irenaeus in Lyon, and there Bishop de Bourgh visited to recruit men, young men, to become priests for service in Louisiana. At the time, Portier was a subdeacon. He volunteered. He worked in Louisiana until Bishop de Bourgh ordained him a priest on September 29th, 1818. Portier nearly died in one of the yellow fever epidemics that broke out, and the seminarians uploaded, well, all of you, I have 3 old videos on yellow fever on different, and that's just barely touching the surface. Those are just three particular outbreaks about yellow fever. So, and it's on this channel, and seminarians uploaded it to the Google site. So Anyway, Portier stayed at his post, ministering to yellow fever victims, bringing last rites and viaticum. So he contracted yellow fever, but it did not enter that tertiary, the black vomit stage, which has almost, once it gets to that point, it's almost 100% fatal. So he recovered. He then continued working in Louisiana until being ordained a bishop to serve as Apostolic Vicar of Alabama, Florida. And he was ordained on November 5th, 1826. When he took up his new responsibilities, he discovered that he had a total of 3 priests to cover all of Alabama and Florida. The parish, the Immaculate Conception in Mobile, and we've already covered that history earlier. It's a very long history. Although the name's changed a few times, but it has continuity as a canonical construct. That parish served as the cathedral parish in Mobile, and at which he would be the only priest, the bishop. He'd be the only priest there. Second, he had St. Augustine Parish in Florida, also staffed by 1 priest. And he had the church in Pensacola, St. Teresa in Pensacola, also staffed by 1 priest. So Portier convinced a cousin of his to move to Mobile. His cousin was at that point a subdeacon named Gabriel Chalon, Chalon. He was studying in the seminary, St. Mary's Seminary, but the one in St. Louis, Missouri, not the one in Baltimore. 11 months after Alabama, Florida was constituted as a single Apostolic Vicariate, the Diocese of St. Louis, Missouri came into being. So we've visited St. Louis a few times. Missouri had been explored by a Catholic priest first in 1673. This is the expedition of the Jesuit, Father Jacques Marquette, which we covered in an earlier session. Subsequently, Jesuits established what they called reductions, but they were like religious colonies along the Illinois River and the upper Mississippi River. Bishop Dubourg recruited Vincentian priests as well as women religious of the Sacred Heart to establish missions in that region in what eventually became the state of Missouri. Which means there was and the success of those missions in bringing coherence and to Catholic life in that area is what justified carving it out as a separate diocese. So when Pope Leo XII did this, it was an immense swath of territory, ranging from Illinois up to the Great Lakes, from Missouri, from St. Louis, Missouri, up to the Great Lakes, Illinois, and then west to the Rocky Mountains. So all that was made the Diocese of St. Louis, Missouri, on July 14th, 1826. The founding bishop was one of the Vincentian priests recruited by Bishop Dubourg. And this was Bishop Joseph Rosati, an Italian Vincentian. It's Rosati. Rosati was born in Naples, Italy. It's southwest Italy, in 1789. He was a younger son of an Italian aristocratic family. He joined the Congregation of the Mission, which is the official name for the Vincentians, ordained a priest in 1811. He was giving missions, parish missions, and retreats in Rome when he was recruited by Bishop Dubourg to come to the Diocese of Louisiana and the 2 Floridas. He is the one, and we said Bishop Dubourg established the seminary, but obviously he didn't do this alone. So Rosati was the one actually on site who established the seminary of St. Mary of the Barons in Perryville, Missouri, which is now Kendrick, Lennon. When Rosati became bishop, Missouri had 21 priests and 25 seminarians. Well, 25 were in his seminary, though not all of those seminarians were going to be priests in his diocese. So it was doing pretty well. I mean, so the seeds de Bourg laid, and were flourishing there. By the time Rosati died in 1823, he was followed by a guy we've already met as a bishop, Peter Richard Kenrick, an Irish immigrant born in Dublin, the younger brother of Francis Kenrick, whom we met already and will meet again, as Peter Kenrick was ordained in 1833, ordained a priest, when his older brother Francis became Bishop of Philadelphia. And Peter was bishop, and then when it was elevated, Archbishop of St. Louis from 1843 until 1893. Because the guy was just immortal. In 1847, St. Louis was raised to the status of an archdiocese, with 5 suffragan dioceses carved out of that territory. Eventually, not all at once, but in 1837, Dubuque was carved out, covering initially the states of Iowa and the 2 Dakotas, although they weren't the 2 Dakotas yet, but the Dakota Territory. Founding Bishop Matthias Loris, another French immigrant. The Diocese of Nashville, Tennessee, same year, 1837, covering initially the whole diocese of Tennessee, the whole state of Tennessee. Founding Bishop, a Dominican, Richard Pius Miles. Chicago, Illinois, 1843, which at the time covered the whole state of Illinois. Founding Bishop William Quarter, as in, a quarter, like the quarter. Yeah. Milwaukee, 1843, covering initially all of Wisconsin. Founding Bishop, a Swiss immigrant, Father John Martin Henny, Henni. And St. Paul, Minnesota, 1850, founding bishop, another French immigrant, priest, Bishop Joseph Crétin, initially covering all of Minnesota. Now that's all during Peter Kenrick's reign in St. Louis. Before the 19th century closed, 19 new dioceses would be carved out of that original Diocese of St. Louis. By the end of the 20th century, that number rose to 45. 45 dioceses carved out of that original 1847 Diocese of St. Louis. Okay, the third one. 4 days after St. Louis became a diocese, the Mississippi was carved out as a distinct Apostolic Vicariate. Like the Alabama-Florida situation, the Catholic development certainly had not matched that in the St. Louis region. It had 3 Catholic communities at Natchez, Mississippi, Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Old Biloxi, which is now Gulfport, Mississippi. There is a Biloxi in Mississippi now, which is a diocese, but it's not the same one. On July 28th, 1837, Mississippi was elevated to the next level, an ordinary see, initially based at Natchez. So the Diocese of Natchez was created in 1837. The founding bishop was Jean Chance, spelled with an E, C-H-A-N-C-H-E. He had 2 priests. Chance was born in Baltimore, Maryland, but both of his parents were French immigrants. He was born in 1795. Studied at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore, joined the Sulpicians, ordained a priest 1819. He taught and was serving as president of St. Mary's College in Baltimore when he was appointed to be the founding bishop of Natchez. The diocese consisted of 46,000 square miles, 375,000 inhabitants, though of course only a tiny minority were Catholic. Natchez remained the only diocese in the state of Mississippi until the mid-20th century. In 1956, the name was changed to the Diocese of Natchez-Jackson, and in 1977, the see was relocated definitively to Jackson. And in the same year, 1977, the Diocese of Biloxi was carved out to cover 17 counties in the southern part of the state. The founding bishop of Biloxi was Joseph Howze, Howze, the first African-American ordained a bishop in the 20th century for a diocese in the United States. And that's the situation. Mississippi still just has the two dioceses, Natchez in the north, Biloxi in the south. Not Natchez, Jackson in the north and Biloxi in the south. God, my brain. So now back to the first one, Alabama. In June of 1828, 2 years after Mississippi was made an Apostolic Vicariate, Michael Portier left Europe to recruit priests and raise money for Alabama, Florida, just as his mentor, Bishop de Bourgh, had done. He happened to be in Rome when Pope Leo XII died in 1829. Now he was not a cardinal, so he couldn't vote, but he stayed to see what was going to happen, and he was able to meet the new pope, Pius VIII. The result of that meeting was the elevation of Alabama, Florida, to an ordinary diocese. It became the Diocese of Mobile, Alabama, on the 9th of May, 1829, with Portier as the bishop. Portier returned to Mobile in January of 1830 with new recruits, 4 priests, 4 subdeacons, and 2 younger seminarians who were still in minor orders. Among the priests, Portier concluded, were Matthias Loris, who would become the founding bishop of Dubuque, Iowa in 1837, and John Stephan Bazine, who became the 3rd bishop of Vincennes, Indiana in 1847. And now that's Indianapolis. In the same year, Mobile became a diocese, 1829, in the context of the Protestant Second Great Awakening. The American Bible Society was created. Among other their primary mission was to have Bibles printed and either given away, or sold very cheap, as cheap as they possibly could. So that's certainly a good thing. But it also included, since they, was a publishing house also, so they not only printed Bibles, they printed other things. And this publication drive included most of the categories of anti-Catholicism of the day: doctrinal, political, evangelical, sensationalist, and xenophobic. So doctrinal, of course, they repudiate the transubstantiation, the hierarchy, holy orders, most of our sacraments, accuse Catholics of worshiping statues, idolatry. Political anti-Catholicism is the assertion that Catholics cannot be good citizens, they cannot be loyal citizens, because they owe prior allegiance to a foreign Italian prince, the Pope. Evangelical anti-Catholicism is denouncing the church for being non-biblical. Sensationalist anti-Catholicism is the scandal mongering, either widely publicizing actual scandals, or just, as we'll see in a few cases, just making stuff up. And xenophobic anti-Catholicism, which brings us, which is the ethnic hatred. That they see, who was coming in, who are the Catholics coming in, whether, Irish, French, Italians, later the Poles, Czechs, Slovenians, Croatians, Hungarians, and to see all of that as diluting the purity of, the English heritage, English Protestant heritage of the country. This had the ancillary advantage from the Protestant perspective of promoting cooperation among the different denominations so they could set aside their own doctrinal differences by focusing on something they all agree on, which was anti-Catholicism. 1829 was also when the next president was sworn in. 1828 was the election year. And he was sworn in. At the time, they were doing the swearing in of the president in March, and later that was moved to January. So President number 7, Andrew Jackson, was sworn in on March 4th, 1829, same year as the American Bible Association was founded. So we met him before. Andrew Jackson was born in Waxhaw, South Carolina. He volunteered to serve in the Revolutionary Army at the age of 14. He was captured, subject to violent abuse by British soldiers, an experience that is generally believed to have channeled his adult personality into the violent, belligerent path that it took. After the success of the Revolutionary War, and he grew up. He studied law, obtained a position as state solicitor for North Carolina in 1788, where he gained valuable experience. So as a state attorney, essentially, he would be the one that would go to court, if the state was bringing a suit, or being attacked, then. In other words, he worked for the Attorney General, the State Attorney General. He, despite his success in North Carolina, he decided to leave, to pursue even more success in what was then the West. This is the period of continental expansion. So he relocated to Tennessee and began another successful career. Turned out to be a very lucrative law practice, private law practice, and then he also parlayed that into a second public career, such that he participated in the Constitutional Convention that created the state of Tennessee in 1796. He served as in the founding delegation of the new state to the House of Representatives. Then, after serving a term there, he became a senator for the state. He did not serve out that full term because he became justice of the state Supreme Court of Tennessee for 6 years, 1798 to 1804. He invested the proceeds of his law practice into purchase of a cotton plantation on the Cumberland River. And yes, plantation, that means slaves. So yes, he was a slave owner. He was a plantation slave owner. One of 7 U.S. presidents who owned slaves. And I don't know what to say. I'm sorry. I wish it hadn't happened, but yes, he did own a cotton plantation, and it was worked by slaves. He also renovated an antebellum house into an envied mansion called the Hermitage. The Hermitage. He obtained an officer's commission in the Tennessee Militia, which is a forerunner of the National Guard, achieved a string of victories fighting against the Creek Indians. Yes, that's another, slavery is not the only, part of of American history that is being rethought now, reinterpreted now. The Creek Indian Wars were 1813, 1814. So with this background, he was offered a commission as a major general in the U.S. Army during the War of 1812. And it was from that position that he inflicted the decisive defeat on the British at the Battle of New Orleans covered previously in 1815, January 1815. In 1818, he invaded Florida, then Spanish territory, on the this is, you see, this is the problem with it, that it takes so much background to like, nothing just happens, but this would take us too far afield. So I'll just say it was on the pretense of punishing Seminole Indians in Florida for raiding into Alabama and Georgia. The ensuing chaos of the Seminole Wars in Florida was a contributing factor to Spain agreeing to sell Florida to the United States in 1821, which we covered previously. He ran for president in 1824, as we saw, and he lost it in the 12th Amendment procedure in the House, what was universally regarded as a fraudulent process. So he easily defeated Quincy Adams in the next election in 1828, and he secured a second term in 1832. Now, connecting back to the political parties in American history, they, as we saw, that their political parties are not in the Constitution, yet they are also not against the Constitution, because the Constitution does give us the right of free assembly, the right to free speech and free assembly. So he ran as a Democrat. Now, this is the Democrats that were in continuity with the Anti-Federalists who became the Democratic Republicans under the leadership of Thomas Jefferson. So by this point, they're just the Democrats. Jackson reinvented the party of Jefferson and used it to reshape American politics and the executive branch in a way that was permanent. I mean, like neither of the American politics nor the executive branch were the same after Jackson. So he really is a historic figure in many respects. Like Jefferson, he was a wealthy plantation owner, so he was an elite. Yet he purported to despise elites. Now, when he said it, he was referring to the rich East Coast elites, because the way in his characterization, they were not good, honest farmers, who made their living from the earth, like him, or he used slaves to make his living from the earth, which you know what I mean. Instead, they manipulated the economy, manipulated finance, through the strong central apparatus installed by the Federalists. So Jackson was a strong states' rights guy against the strong federal government. So, for example, Jackson's changes. He ceased government funding of infrastructure projects. So remember, one of the Federalist ideas was a mixed economy, public-private partnerships, as we'd say now, for large-scale terraforming, and originally canals and railroads and bridges. And they, as we saw, they achieved much success. But Jackson ceased that. He did not like that idea of public-private. He asserted that he was not against business, but he did not think they should have that the government should be involved in that. He deemed that the responsibility of the states. Second, he initiated the spoils system, as it was called by critics, into public service by firing all non-elected federal employees and replacing them with his own supporters. That process was replicated by both parties, whoever was in power, for the next 50 years. So it successfully took the federal government out of the loop, really. Not completely. It didn't destroy the federal government, but it did limit the effectiveness until the Civil War. And then, then Lincoln, then another centralization had to take place. But then after the Civil War, particularly in the Grant administration, they went right back to the spoils system, which of course undermined the the effectiveness of public service, such that eventually a reform was made in 1883, the Pendleton Act, which is also called the Civil Service Act. It created the civil service, which is the idea that non-elected government employees ideally should be ideologically neutral, that their party shouldn't matter, that they would just stay, like they would be professional. They'd be a professional civil service. Now they'd be accountable to elected officials, of course, so that that was the idea. But they would not just be all fired and replaced every time a new guy came into power. And third, he vetoed renewal of the charter of the Bank of the United States in 1832. The Bank of the United States is a forerunner, sort of the Federal Reserve. And he distributed the assets of the Bank of the United States to the states. All right, now this will take a little more time to discuss. The construct of a central bank also does not appear in the Constitution. Yet it is also not necessarily unconstitutional, because Congress is given authority, a measure of authority over commerce and finance and interstate commerce. So the idea of a central bank is not necessarily unconstitutional, although some would assert that it is. For a lot of reasons, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to get into all that. So there is no article of the Constitution that creates a central bank, in other words. Now, as covered previously, the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, was a passionate advocate of financial stability as absolutely essential for the new republic to survive, for other countries to take it seriously. For that, Hamilton believed a central bank, a federal bank, so to speak, was indispensable. He convinced Washington of his view. He argued that the legal power to create a federal bank existed in the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8. That lists 18 enumerated powers that the federal government has. Power number 18 in that list reads as follows, quote, "To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers," meaning the previous 17 listed, "and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or any department or officer thereof." So the necessary and proper clause. Critics have called it the elastic clause, that like the same argument, okay, the Constitution doesn't create a central bank. Well, there are many things the government, especially now, has that was not created in the Constitution. And some critics would say, okay, that if it wasn't specifically created by the Constitution, then in one of these 18 enumerated powers, then the federal government doesn't have a constitutional right to do it. Therefore, if it is to be done at all, it should belong to the states. Whereas Federalists, and those, in continuity with that mindset that still exists, argue that this power number 18, the necessary and proper clause, does give the government a wide latitude to create new constructs as needed for what it says, for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. And all other powers, let's see why it's called the elastic clause, all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government or any department or office thereof. So that argument continues. There's still those who believe that the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional. I'm certainly not going to pronounce on that. So, but anyway, that's the historic background. So decide for yourselves. Hamilton got his way initially. The first Bank of the United States, Federal Bank of the United States, was chartered in 1791, and it had a sunset clause. It was chartered for a term of 20 years. the Treasury placed $10 million in holdings in the bank and retained control of 1/5 of the bank, opening the rest, 4/5, to investment by private businesses as well as state banks. So this is in keeping with Hamilton's view of the mixed economy, the public-private partnership. So it was not purely a federal bank. I mean, it was a federal bank, but it was not exclusively a federal bank. The bank notes, the notes of this bank, became recognized and trusted as a form of currency because it was easier to carry around than gold and silver coins. Nevertheless, the bank's charter was allowed to expire in 1811, owing to opposition in Congress from those who believed that the central bank was just a tool of the elites, of the, those in the, connected, those who were connected, to manipulate the economy for their benefit at the detriment of everyone else. The allowing, now again, I'm not taking sides on this, so I'm just not saying which, but just what happened is once that was allowed to lapse, a 5-year period of economic instability occurred in the banking system of the country. Because remember, state banks could and did invest in that bank. So when that bank disappeared, then that's an investment on the books of the state banks that's no longer there. So that harms them. And then people who use the state banks, even if they never did anything with the central bank, they also are affected. So that limits what, so the state banks say, okay, what can we loan? And if they don't offer loans, then some people, who need that to keep their business going, they don't have it. So then their business collapses. And then the people who worked for them are unemployed. So they can't spend money the way they, so that there's maybe it's a cliche to say it's complicated, but it really is complicated. So after this 5-year period of instability, Congress chartered a second bank of the United States, a second federal bank, in 1816. 3 years later, 1819, President Monroe, whom we've already met, appointed a Philadelphia financier named Nicholas Biddle, Biddle, to serve as head of the bank, or president of the bank, or at that point he might have had the title chancellor, but anyway, he was the CEO of the bank. He solidified a national system of banking credit to promote business. So Biddle had that federalist attitude, the public-private partnership, that the federal bank would not exclusively be a federal bank, that it would be open to these other investors, public in the sense of state banks, as well as other businesses. And with that, using that as the nucleus, the federal bank as the nucleus, then there could be an array of these other banks, both state banks as well as private banks, to have a secure, to form the architecture, the skeleton, so to speak, of a banking credit system, so that all these other banks, in other words, to build the economy, right? Because if people are secure in borrowing, then they're more likely to invest, they're more likely to take risks, and some of those risks are going to pay off and make a lot of money for everybody involved and put a lot of people to work. And so they can spend money on other things, which is going to make other businesses prosper. So, it kind of feeds itself. All right, time passes. Andrew Jackson becomes president in 1829. Part of his platform on which he was elected was public raging against the central bank, the federal bank, as unconstitutional and unfair to small farmers and small businesses. When he let it be known that he would veto a charter renewal, and the only way Congress could overcome it was by a 2/3 vote to overcome his veto, and the numbers didn't look like it would work at that time. So Nicholas Biddle, then applied to Congress. He went before Congress and requested an extension of the existing charter in 1832. Now, that was 4 years before it was set to expire, but he hoped to get Congress to do it, to kind of outmaneuver Jackson. Jackson vetoed the renewal anyway, and as Biddle feared, Congress lacked the votes to override that veto. So the Central Bank of the United States closed for the second time. This was followed by the Panic of 1837, which was the worst economic collapse in American history up to that point since Thomas Jefferson imposed the protectionist tariffs of 1809. Now, again, I'm not taking sides. I mean, that's just what happened. So now those who, depending on what side, those who had the Federalist attitude would take both of these economic collapses as evidence that, that they're right, that the public-private partnership idea is right, the central bank is right. Whereas the other side, would point to these two collapses as evidence for their position to say that, you see, that the central bank did warp and distort the organic development of the economy. And so that's why the collapses happen. So, again, decide what as you wish. Jackson's reimagining of the Democratic Party, coupled with the discrediting of the Federalist owing to the alleged corrupt bargain, which gave the previous election to Quincy Adams, led to the collapse of the first two-party system in American history, meaning that the Federalist disappeared as a coherent organization. The ideology did not, some of those constituent ideas did not completely go away, but as a coherent organization, the Federalist Party disappeared. Jackson's rhetoric and actions against the National Bank, coupled with resentment of his spoils system, enabled a new version of the two-party system. The Democrats, but Jackson's Democrats now, and the Whigs. I know it sounds stupid, but that's what Whigs, W-H-I-G-S, and yes, Whig is in, the hymn. Those fans of European history, English history, know that in English politics, there also were Whigs, a political party with the Whigs. So the Whigs in American history were not institutionally directly connected to the British Whigs, but did take inspiration from the British Whigs as that party, the Whigs in England, sought to limit the power of the monarchy by Parliament, by an elected Parliament, a responsible legislature, as they say, meaning ultimately responsible to the voters. So the Whigs, the British Whigs, were small government, sort of. We could say, to oversimplify things, they small government but favored private business. And Jackson agreed with that. He believed in a small, weak federal government, and did not want government tampering with business. Just let the sort of the laissez-faire idea, let businesses just do their thing without government interference, to either succeed or fail. Jackson's attitudes. So the Democrats, the new Democrats, Jacksonian Democrats, some of his attitudes were traceable to Jefferson. Like, he didn't repudiate all those ideas, but he pursued them with tactics designed, ironically, to create a far stronger executive branch than Jefferson envisioned. So this is one of these ironies in American history. That Jackson, who part of the reason he got elected was that he wanted to weaken the federal government, and he did indeed weaken it when he vetoed and closed for a time the central bank, the federal bank. Yet he, at the same time, he wanted to strengthen one branch of the federal government, namely the presidency. So there are all these just contradictions. But anyway, former Federalists seeking to rebrand themselves as Whigs did so by ridiculing Jackson in the newspapers, journals, and pamphlets of the day, the media of the day. They called him King Andrew, a dangerous man on horseback, flailing a sword around, who would trample anyone in his path. At the same time, they recognized that Jackson had benefited from the prevailing perception that the Old Federalists were composed of corrupt East Coast, arrogant aristocrats with no regard for the common man, either the farmer, the common farmer, or the freehold farmer, or the urban laborer. And into this context, Henry Clay re-enters our story. Henry Clay was also in need of some public rehabilitation after using, or at least, allegedly, using his position as Speaker of the House to steal the election from Jackson and give it to Quincy Adams, and then accepting appointment as Secretary of State, allegedly, as payment. So in his rehabilitation phase, Henry Clay synthesized some of these elements into a political and economic platform on which he and subsequent politicians would run, called the American System, that became the foundation of the Whig Party, which would exist up to the Civil War. So this American System, American Whigs, in continuity with the Old Federalists, the American Whigs held to a national bank, that it should be restored, to maintain currency value, and connected to, but in some senses even more important than, to maintain a stable credit structure so that businesses, could grow. Second, the American Whigs held that the federal government, the mixed economy, so they kept that idea of the federal government investment, federal public-private partnerships to invest in infrastructure development, terraforming, bridges, roads, canals, to knit the states together and to easily trafficked arteries to promote commerce. But the Whigs departed from the Old Federalist in the following ways. They supported high protective tariffs to protect domestic production from potentially cheaper imports. Second, they departed from the Old Federalists in believing that federal land should be kept expensive in order to generate revenue for the fisc, for the treasury, either through sale of that land or preferably for regular income to lease or rent that land. And third, the rule of law, as they would say. Now that term gets used a lot in ways that are often internally contradictory, but when they used it, they meant, especially in terms of expansion of the country and foreign policy, by limiting the executive branch. Remember, these are anti-Jacksonians, so they wanted to pull back. They wanted to retract some of the powers and the aggrandizement of the executive branch that Jackson had successfully implemented. So they wanted a strong Congress, but a weak executive. The Whig Party achieved a period of success, but contained within itself one insoluble problem. Can you guess what it is? It's the very first problem that we covered in the very first lecture in this course: slavery. It will not go away. That is the original sin, of the American Republic. How to deal with slavery. Henry Clay himself was a plantation owner, and that means slaves. He was from Kentucky. Quincy Adams, who joined the Whigs when he returned to Congress after losing the presidency, even though he was in the same party with Clay and they were political allies in many respects, but in the slavery, Quincy Adams detested slavery, and he thought that it would destroy the Union, as eventually it did. So in the early years of the Whig Party, prodded by the imperative to oppose Jackson, these two branches of the Whigs just ignored slavery. So the abolitionists like Quincy Adams, as well as the plantation owners, the slave owners like Clay, they just ignored the issue. But in the long run, the Whig Party would be torn apart by this because they just couldn't agree. And then the abolitionists would join the new Republican Party, which doesn't even exist yet in this period we're talking about, and then the others would become Democrats. And then that would be the next two-party structure, which we'll get to. So, in terms of the Civil War, the end of the Republic, the original Republic, Abraham Lincoln started politics in Illinois as a Whig, as one of these, but an anti-slavery Whig. He retired from public life, as it turned out, not permanently, but he did retire from public life in 1849 in disgust over this issue of the slavery issue. And he did not return until a new political party was created, an abolitionist Republican Party, all of which we'll see in more detail in due course. Pope Leo XII died on February 10th, 1829. He was followed by Francesco Saverio Castiglione, who, as Pope 253, reigned under the title Pius VIII from a very brief reign, March of 1829 to November of 1830. In 1830, Mexico, the government in Mexico became fearful that too many Anglo settlers were moving in, taking advantage of the colonization law, were moving into Coahuila y Tejas, fraudulently moving in under false pretenses, meaning they were fraudulently claiming that they were accepting Catholicism, and that they, were going to be loyal citizens of Mexico. So in 1830, Mexico passed, rescinded, revoked, repealed the colonization law of 1821. In response, the Anglo citizens of Texas, the Anglos who became Mexican citizens in Texas, sent Stephen Austin to Mexico City to request that they be allowed to secede from Mexico and become independent. The Mexicans considered that treason, so they actually imprisoned Austin for a time. Obviously, they denied the request, and they did repeal the colonization law. And later, they released Austin. But that showed their attitude. And this is another step, 1830 is another step toward the Mexican-American War, 16 years later. Meanwhile, in terms of religious history, another category of the Protestant Restoration movement of the Second Great Awakening was the Latter-day Saints movement, or the Mormon movement. We referenced them a couple of times when I did the review of how the Supreme Court has dealt with religious freedom, because Catholics, like Mormons, have had experience with the courts demonstrating that the conventional interpretation of the separation of church and state is that the government can interfere with the church, but the church cannot interfere with the state. So both Catholics and Mormons have been on the receiving end of that. So the Latter-day Saints movement was pioneered by Joseph Smith. He was born in Vermont, moved to New York. Now, just summarize, I'm not, obviously I'm not a Mormon, I'm a Catholic priest, so I don't claim to be a Mormon theologian, but just historically, to configure this chronologically, he asserted that on the 23rd of September, 1823, a supernatural being, an angel named Moroni, appeared to him and explained that 600 years earlier, 600 years before the birth of Christ, God led a group of faithful from Jerusalem to New York. Moroni had originally been a human, and before dying and ascending to become an angel, was the last prophet with that group. Before his death, he wrote down their story and buried it. In 1827, the now ascended Moroni deemed Joseph Smith ready, so revealed the location of the sacred writings, buried under a hill in Manchester, New York. Joseph Smith described them as being written on golden tablets in a language he called Reformed Egyptian. Smith was able to translate them by means of a seer stone. After translating the tablets, he obtained the signed testimony of a group of witnesses that the tablets existed, then gave them back to the angel, at which point they have not been seen again in the material, continuum. Smith published a translation of this as the Book of Mormon on March 26th, 1830. The Mormons do not see this. Again, this is my understanding, so if I'm wrong, I apologize, but my understanding is that the Mormons do not see the Book of Mormon as a replacement for the Bible. They see it as a supplement, as another revelation. Mormon, so who is this guy? Mormon was the name of Moroni's father, who entrusted to him the sacred writings which he had compiled. So Smith claimed that, remember this is in the context of Protestant Restorationism, which is all based on the Acts of the Apostles. Smith claimed that the Latter-day Saints movement was fulfilling Acts of the Apostles chapter 3, verses 19 through 26, which, at least the beginning, reads, quote, "Repent, therefore, and be converted, that your sins may be wiped away, and the Lord may grant you a time of refreshment, and send you the Messiah." That goes on to quote the promise of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, which reads, quote, "A prophet like me will the Lord your God raise up for you among your own kinsmen. To him you shall listen." So Mormons regard Smith as the fulfillment of that prophecy. Okay. The following year, 1830, history changed. The technology, the steam technology, steam engine technology we've encountered has been applied previously to a number of different endeavors. So now in 1830, it is going to be applied to transportation over land. Now we've seen it applied to transportation over water with the steamboat. Now it's over land with the railroad, the locomotive. Previously, a guy named George Stephenson tried to do this. He made a steam-powered wagon to travel over land, but it proved to be impractical at the time because it was too heavy, and the wheels, it was so heavy, not only the engine, but you had to have material to dump in it, like coal to dump in it. So it's already so heavy before you even put a cargo on it. So it proved to be too heavy; it would sink into the ground. So it was too heavy for existing roads and simply could not travel off-road. This obstacle was overcome in 1830, 16 years later, when an American engineer named Peter Cooper attached metal wheels to a chassis on a wagon, on a steam wagon, at the bottom of a steam wagon, then laid down on the ground parallel metal rails on top of perpendicular wooden beams of a uniform level, so that the metal beams would be at the same level. Then put the steam wagon with metal wheels on top of those metal rails to roll on. So that would solve the problem of weight. This steam-powered locomotive atop a road made of metal rails, coupled with the steam ship, solved the problem of logistics, commercial logistics, of how to quickly transport goods, raw materials like coal or wood, silk, and to transport them from wherever they're dug up to a factory for commercial application, then from the factory to the market to generate profit. So the railroad, the locomotive and the railroad, along with the steamship, another escalation in the Industrial Revolution. Now, regardless of one's ideology with regard to economics or politics, it was simply not possible to pay for such devices and for the networks of railroads. It was not possible to pay for these simply by transporting huge piles of gold and silver to pay for workers and material. So the result was an expansion of the use of a previously formulated economic construct, paper money, or paper bills of credit, as they were called. Which, when we go back to the John Law, this meant it was possible to spend more paper money than any nation could possibly back with gold or silver. If anybody ever demanded the balance at once. So as a result, even though the United States and Western Europe, for the most part, pretended that their economy was based on the gold standard, in practice, large-scale investment, such as terraforming and the infrastructure projects like the railroads and the canals, was funded by liquid capital, which means paper bills of credit that everyone pretended at the time. Now, we don't even pretend anymore, but at the time they were pretending that it was backed by the gold reserves of the country. But in fact, they were only backed by the perceived stability of the nation. Because that means, even those who realized what was going on, it was a worthwhile, if the nation was on the whole stable, that means the economy would continue to function, and then the money would churn. So they would invest the paper money, they would get a railroad, then they could charge money, for transporting cargo, transporting passengers. Then that money they could use and invest, make more railroads, make more money. They can invest in businesses along the railroads, so that, but all of that is predicated on the country being stable, because that means the economy would be stable. So then they could all pretend, from that perspective, the paper money doesn't have to be backed by gold. It's just used to facilitate a medium of exchange. So anyway, again, I'm not taking sides. Wherever you think about the economy, that's just discussing this historically. Same year, 1830, on May 28th, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. Yes, that's what it was called. I'm sorry, that's what it was called. This act provided for the removal of Indian tribes in the southeast United States, removing them from the southeast United States by exchanging their land for land that would be reserved for them west of the Mississippi River in what would become, what is now the state of Oklahoma. So these are reservations. No, not all of them wanted to do this. Not everyone wanted to walk from Georgia to Oklahoma. So this had to be enforced by the military. Military enforcement of this relocation is what in the history, Native American history, is described as the Trail of Tears. The first targets were the Choctaw, beginning on September 27th, 1830. Next, the Chickasaw, 1832. Next, the Muskogee, 1834. Next, the Cherokee, 1838. To put some numbers to this, 46,000 members of these tribes, Indians, native indigenous peoples, were removed, thereby freeing 25 million acres of land in the southeast for American settlement. The most significant resistance, now this is what I was, this was the background to what I alluded to earlier, the Seminole Wars. The most significant resistance to this relocation was among the Seminole tribes in Florida, and so the United States waged a war against Florida, against the Seminole in Florida. Between December 28th, 1835, started then, so American soldiers moved into Florida. They were ambushed by Seminoles, and 107 American soldiers were killed in what is now Dade County, Florida. And so the war continued from 1835 for 7 years until the surrender of the last Seminole chief on August 14th, 1842. In the same year, 1830, in church history, we meet another cleric enters our story, Samuel Charles Mazzuchelli, who is a Dominican. Born in 1806 in Milan, northern Italy, the 16th of 17 children. Baptized Carlo Gaetano Mazzuchelli. At the age of 17, he entered the order of preachers, the Dominicans. After his novitiate, his name in religion was changed to Friar Samuel. He went to Rome for his complete major seminary, was ordained a subdeacon in 1827. So remember, that's the first of the major orders. That's when the commitment to celibacy is made. Was ordained in the Lateran Basilica, the cathedral of the Pope, in his capacity as Bishop of Rome. In 1828, Mazzuchelli set out for the United States, where he was welcomed to Cincinnati by a fellow Dominican, who was the bishop in Cincinnati, Edward Fenwick. He was ordained a priest by Fenwick in 1830, assigned to serve at St. Anne Church on Mackinac Island, and later in northern Wisconsin. 5 years of this service later, Mazzuchelli arrived in Dubuque, Iowa, where he organized a parish under the patronage of the Archangel Raphael, which later became the cathedral when Dubuque was made a diocese in 1837. He remained in the new diocese, assisting the first bishop, Matthias Loris, whom we met earlier, recruited by Bishop Portier from Mobile. Father Mazzuchelli, in the first few years of the Diocese of Dubuque, worked extensively in what would later be carved out into yet another diocese, the Diocese of Madison, Wisconsin. So in this area, Father Mazzuchelli founded over 30 parishes, personally designed and built or oversaw the building of 20 church buildings. 3 of those parishes were named after the 3 archangels: St. Raphael's we met in Dubuque, St. Michael's in Galena, Illinois, and St. Gabriel's in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. In 1846, he founded a college, Cincinnati Mound College. In 1847, he founded a Dominican congregation of sisters, the Cincinnati Dominican Sisters. In 1848, he founded Santa Clara, called it Female Academy. I know that doesn't sound right, the way we use English today, but it was a girls' school, Santa Clara School for Girls, which later became Dominican University, a frontier school for young women, which he entrusted to those Dominican sisters, the Cincinnati Dominican Sisters. Father Mazzuchelli died on February 23rd, 1864, after contracting an illness from a parishioner he went to give to whom he gave last rites in viaticum. The year Father Mazzuchelli was ordained, 1830, Pope Pius VIII died on November 30th, followed by Bartolomeo Capillari, who, as Pope 254, reigned under the name Gregory XVI from 1831 to 1846. In 1831, year of his election in American history, the Boston to Providence Railroad was chartered. This was the beginning of reforming the dynamics of the economy of the United States. So Boston, Massachusetts to Providence, Rhode Island, 2 different states. So this is a proof of concept of the railroads. You know, could it actually work over distance, you know, from one state to another? So they got the charter as a company to, you know, protect it legally in 1831. Took a while to build. Took 4 years to build. It was completed in 1835. But it worked, as we'll see later. It worked. And that would really change things. Okay, 1830s are a lot of different things are going to happen in the 1830s. So we've been going for a while. So we'll pause here, and we'll pick up with the reign of Gregory the 16th. 1831 was the railroads. 1832, he condemned liberal Catholicism, which included condemning some things like democracy and free speech and freedom of the press. And these things are going to be used in another wave of anti-Catholicism in the United States in the 1830s. So it's another thing, another unit. So we'll pause here, pick up with that next time. So thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.